Are we ready? Good evening, everybody, both in the church and online, and a really warm welcome to Ipswich Minster for this, the second instalment of our A Church for England series. Here we are seeking to create a space where we can explore what a good Church of England should look like for the nation it serves, through the lens of some of the most vital issues of our time. We are deeply honoured to welcome tonight's speaker, who I think heroically has battled the A12 to be here this evening. Everyone in Suffolk knows how much of a challenge that can be. To welcome tonight Bishop Guli Francis Dehqani, the Bishop of Chelmsford. Born in Iran, Bishop Guli and her family came to the UK as refugees following the revolution in 1979. This formative experience has clearly shaped much of her ministry and her life, and her deep concern for justice, dignity, and inclusion. And you can find more about this in a really quite brilliant Desert Island Discs that she guested on the BBC last year, which I'm sure can still be found online. Bishop Guli was ordained in 1998 and has since served in a variety of roles across the church before becoming the first Bishop of Loughborough in 2017 and then the Bishop of Chelmsford in 2021. She sits in the House of Lords, where she brings a vital Christian voice to public and national debate. And alongside all of this, and especially important for our talk this evening, she is the Church of England's lead bishop for housing, where she plays a key role in shaping the Church's national response to issues around housing, championing the vision of housing as a matter of justice and dignity. In all she does, as I have observed from afar, Bishop Guli brings a pastoral depth, a theological voice, and a powerful voice to those on the margins. She is therefore uniquely placed to help us think about what a good church should look like when it comes to issues of housing, not just as a commentator, but as a leader calling us to action. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Guli.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for your very generous words and for your welcome. It's very good to be here this evening. I've never been to Ipswich before, never mind to Ipswich Minster, and I've enjoyed hearing a little bit about your journey over the last few years. So I'm going to speak for probably around about 30 minutes. I hope that's all right, give or take a few minutes. And then I hope there'll be an opportunity for questions if you have any, or comments, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of a discussion going. Just over 100 years ago, a young curate called Basil Jellicoe was sent by Magdalen College, Oxford, to serve as their missioner in Somerstown near St Pancras in London. As he explored his new surroundings, he was shocked to find row upon row of slum tenements, 3-storey houses with no running water or sanitation, where families would rent one cockroach-infested room and sleep 3 or more to a bed. These appalling conditions cut to the heart of this young clergyman, who wrote that they'd been produced by selfishness, stupidity, and sin, and only love incarnate could put it right. He went on to reflect that the slums produce something much more terrible than mere discomfiture and discontent. They produce a kind of horrible excommunication, a fiendish plan by the powers of evil to keep people from the happiness for which God made them. Inspired by his faith and determined to challenge poverty, inequality, and the conscience of the rich, Jellicoe joined forces with other local campaigners and formed the St Pancras House Improvement Society. He used his considerable connections in both the church and high society to raise enough money to buy 8 properties, which were then renovated and rented to local people. In 1926, more houses were bought and 52 new flats were created and rented out. His approach was in marked contrast to many commercial landlords at the time. He was determined to keep the rents at the same level as the tenants used to pay in the slums. He was opposed to gentrification and insisted on providing decent homes which even the poorest people of Somers Town could afford. Jellicoe also believed the houses should be beautiful, and he commissioned the distinguished sculptor Gilbert Bayes to design ceramic decorations to go inside the flats, out in the gardens, and on the posts holding up the washing lines. His vision was to make the neighbourhood a pleasant place to live. According to his obituary in the Times, he resolved that he would not rest till his people had homes fit to live in. And the rehousing schemes started by his society have already provided many excellent flats with gardens, trees, ponds, swings for children, and other amenities. Jellicoe was keenly aware of the connection between poor housing and ill health. He had a dramatic flair which made him a natural publicist. So when the builders were demolishing a block of slums that he had acquired to make way for new housing, he fashioned giant cockroaches and bed bugs out of papier-mâché and burned them in a public ceremony. One of his best-known sayings was, "Housing is not enough." The physical improvement to people's housing was necessary, but not sufficient to ensure a flourishing life. They also needed a community in which to live. Consequently, Jellicoe strengthened existing social and support networks and created new ones. Together with his colleagues, he set up rent clubs, nurseries, furniture clubs, and even a pub, which sold beer but not spirits. And he had a restaurant and roof garden for families to enjoy. All these improvements led eventually to the transformation of Somers Town through a process that today we would call regeneration. Sadly, Jellicoe didn't get to see the full fruits of his life's work. He increasingly suffered from mental ill health, which forced him to step down from the board of the St Pancras House Improvement Society, and he died prematurely at the age of just 36. Jellicoe's Christian faith motivated him to see every man, woman, and child, no matter what their condition or status, as someone made in God's image, loved by Christ, and with an inherent dignity, who's worthy of a decent home and a supportive community where they could live and flourish. 90 years later, a similar vision inspired the Archbishop of Canterbury to write Reimagining Britain. In a chapter on housing, Justin Welby wrote, "The first form of reimagining is to reclaim the purpose of housing. Housing exists as a basis for community, and community exists for human flourishing." Welby went on to set up the Archbishop's Commission on Housing, Church and Community to research the housing crisis and think through how the Church of England might respond to it. The Commission's report, entitled Coming Home, Tackling the Housing Crisis Together, is a tour de force. It was published in February 2021. It begins by setting out a positive vision for housing and community based on a biblical understanding of human life and society. It then makes a probing analysis of the causes and consequences of the housing crisis before going on to deliver a series of recommendations, not just to others, but recommendations to the Church. Coming Home spells out what the Church commissioners, dioceses, parishes, and individual Christians can do differently. And it finishes with recommendations for the government and the housing industry. Now, at this point, some people might be skeptical. Why should the Church be involved in housing? Shouldn't we leave that to government and the housing sector and stick to our primary task of sharing the gospel and building up the life of the church. So let me respond first by reading an excerpt. It's a fairly lengthy excerpt from the first chapter of the Coming Home report. The past few hundred years have seen an increasing emphasis on the individual as the fundamental unit of society, suggesting that we are in essence autonomous individuals who might, if we choose, enter into wider relationships. However, there is much within the Christian theological tradition that suggests we were made not primarily as individuals, but as persons in relation to other persons, echoing the personhood of God. Put in the words of Jesus, we were created not to be alone, but to love God and neighbour, to find our identity and well-being not in individual isolation, but in relationships of love and mutual support. Community is therefore vital to human flourishing. If we're unable to build strong, well-functioning communities, then we're storing up trouble for the future. Christian faith, with its central belief that our well-being as individuals is closely tied up with our relationships to God and to each other, cannot avoid wanting to ensure that community life is strong and that the bonds that unite us are guarded carefully. In the Anglican tradition, one of the primary ways this is done is through the parish system. Churches are located in parishes, geographical units that embrace schools, shops, care homes, businesses, council offices, and much more. Clergy are given the cure of souls of the whole parish, not just those who come to church. In other words, the parish system is not just part of Anglican ecclesiology, but also its missiology. Our mission is to care for the whole of the life of a community, not just its spiritual well-being. That's why the Church of England takes an interest in housing, because the nature and quality of housing goes a long way to build or destroy a sense of community. Individual houses with high hedges and no communal spaces, or poor housing that people are desperate to escape from, do not build strong community life. Good housing builds community, bad housing destroys it, and with it, the human flourishing that comes from strong social bonds." End quote. This echoes the thinking and approach of Basil Jellicoe a century ago. And the Coming Home report continues. So, in order to build good communities and to explore how housing can contribute to this, our work started by asking what a good home should be. We believe that fundamentally, a home that can contribute to strong community life can be described in 5 adjectives: sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying. You can tell that a preacher with a love for alliteration had a hand in finalizing the choice of words. But these 5 core values, which have come to be known as the 5 S's, are described as follows. A sustainable home works in harmony with its local environment and sustains the balance of the natural world in which it sits. Safe housing means that home should be a safe place with privacy and security from unwanted intrusion by people, pests, or hazards. Stable housing needs to be affordable, enabling people to put down roots and build healthy lives, families, and neighbourhoods. Housing is sociable when homes and communities have spaces where people can offer hospitality, get to know their neighbours, and feel part of a community where children can play in safety. And finally, satisfying. Satisfying housing means that our homes should be places we enjoy living in and delight coming home to, making the most of good design and good technology. These 5 core values don't just describe what good housing looks like. They also carry a deeper theological content. The report authors go on to write, "The Bible tells a story of a journey from a God-provided home, of humanity then becoming homeless, moving out into a dangerous world, then of a long process of redemption which leads back home again, but to a home which looks different from the first. The story takes the human race from its home with God in Eden, through expulsion from that home, a true dislocation, to the place of return, and to a final picture of God making his home with us. There are, it could be said, 5 key moments in this story: creation, fall, redemption, the new community, the church, and finally, the new creation. And Coming Home weaves this theological framework into the 5 core values to help form a distinctively Christian approach to housing and community. Let me elaborate a little. The value of sustainability is based on the fact that we're called to steward God's good creation. Our building materials, the energy we use, and how we manage our waste should all work with and not against nature. This reflects our human calling as co-creators with God, responsible for looking after the world and passing it on to future generations. The scandal of flammable cladding on tower blocks and poor insulation that causes damp and mould illustrate why safety is so important. Homes should be places where people feel safe and secure. This is necessary due to the fallenness of humanity and the need for building practices that are rooted in loving our neighbours and prioritising resident safety, not taking shortcuts to save costs, is so important. Thirdly, good housing policy creates stable communities where people feel they belong and they want to put down roots and build their lives, families, and friendships. Stability presupposes security of tenure and homes that are genuinely affordable. The Jubilee laws in the Old Testament were designed to ensure every extended family could be rooted in a physical place long term. And in the New Testament, the Son of God grew up in the stable community of Nazareth, which points to God's intentions for human lives. Sociable homes are places that facilitate hospitality and neighbourliness. In communities where generous relationships thrive, new residents are welcomed, who in turn are more likely to contribute to the well-being of others. This reflects the true vision of the church to be a new kind of community, open and welcoming to all, because God's love extends equally to every single person. And finally, homes and communities should be satisfying places to live in. More than bricks and mortar, our built environment should be beautifully designed and incorporate the latest technology to make the experience of living there a pleasure. The gospel story begins with creation and ends with new creation, where everything is transformed through Christ's resurrection. Good homes can point towards that, as a sign and a foretaste of the future home where God draws all creation to himself. So these 5 values are like a window between the gospel and society. Looking through them one way takes us into the biblical story of God's purposes in creation and redemption. Viewed the other way, they provide a framework and a standard for good housing in Britain today. One of the new entities implementing the Coming Home report is turning these 5 core values into a design framework. The Church Development Agency intends to incorporate these 5 values in contracts with architects, developers, and builders to stipulate the quality of housing required on church land. This project is being led by Eddie Hughes, a former MP and housing minister who passionately supports the vision and values of Coming Home. The question we're considering tonight is how the Church of England can be a church for England in the context of the housing crisis. Now, I'm not going to talk about the valuable work that many churches do to support people who are currently experiencing homelessness. That's not to downplay the completely unacceptable levels of homelessness in Britain, but because we also need to tackle the underlying causes, not just the symptoms or the consequences of it. And I want to suggest 4 possible levels at which the church can respond to the housing crisis: the individual Christian, the local parish church, the diocese, and the national church. Firstly, there are around 2.8 million individual landlords in the UK. So I'm safely assuming that many church owners own more than one property, either as accidental landlords or as a business venture. Owning property has been one of the best ways to grow your capital, increase your personal wealth, and provide for your future. Whilst those are legitimate ambitions, for a Christian landlord, they should be tempered by a recognition that although it's perfectly legal to charge the market price for something, that isn't always necessarily the right thing to do. Markets are amoral. They only indicate what is, not what ought to be. So my challenge to Christian landlords is to consider whether they can forego the maximum rent they could obtain and set a more affordable rent level for the tenant, provided that it covers their costs. Tellingly, the Coming Home report includes a 6th value, another S, the need for sacrifice by everyone with a vested interest in the present housing system. Without this, without sacrifice, the housing crisis cannot be alleviated, and the poorest and the most disadvantaged will be the ones continuing to make the sacrifice, having to live in unaffordable, inadequate, or unsafe housing. Individual Christians could also make a difference by renting out a spare room to a refugee or a young working person, or by supporting rather than opposing a new housing development in their neighbourhood. Secondly, at the parish level, many local churches are responsible for buildings that are expensive to heat and maintain, are long overdue on repairs, and aren't really fit for purpose. Some of these properties have the potential to be redeveloped to include a few homes which can help pay for repairing or rebuilding the worship space or church hall. The Archbishop's Council has allocated 4.25 million for a housing project which offers advice and small feasibility grants to parishes. This enables them to take the first steps towards redeveloping their church property to provide both affordable housing and new community or worship spaces. Thirdly, most of the 42 dioceses in the Church of England own some glebe land, fields that were given to the parishes back in the day to provide food for the vicar and his, it always was his, often large household, as well as ex-benefice properties like surplus vicarages. This land and property is generally managed as a rainy day asset, sold off to the highest bidder when there's a hole in the diocesan budget, which is unfortunately all too frequent at the moment. But this isn't the best or even the most desirable way of managing glebe land. But due to a lack of capacity and professional competence, it's the default path that most dioceses take, especially when they're risk averse. The Church Development Agency offers dioceses an alternative to outsourcing the management and disposal of church property commercially. They provide the professional skills and capacity, and they reduce the risk to dioceses and develop land to generate a social as well as a financial return. This can involve partnering with the new Church Housing Association, another of the entities that has been set up in response to the Coming Home report. Chaired by the Bishop of Manchester, the Church Housing Association aims to become a leading provider of high-quality social housing that meets the 5S values, and including community support workers who would be connected with the local parish church. The Church Housing Association is focusing initially on the West Midlands and wants to provide good homes in some of the most challenging and deprived neighbourhoods. For example, they're hoping to buy some of the worst houses on Benefit Street, the subject of a controversial Channel 4 documentary around a decade ago, and to turn them into decent family homes that are let out at social rents. Finally, at the national level, the foremost recommendation of the Coming Home report was to establish a long-term, cross-party national housing strategy. As lead bishop for housing, I've had the privilege of setting up the Homes for All initiative in the House of Lords in partnership with the Nationwide Foundation. We published a report calling for a 25-year outcomes-led strategy to provide decent, affordable housing for homeowners, private renters, and social housing residents alike. We argued that this strategy should have two vital bookends: a clear vision of the destination, in other words, what good housing looks like for everyone, and secondly, a governance and accountability mechanism to ensure continuity across future changes in government. It remains to be seen how far these recommendations are going to be reflected in the government's forthcoming strategy, which is due out sometime in July. Another national opportunity for the Church to impact the nation's housing is through supporting the New Towns programme. Next week, I'm due to meet Sir Michael Lyons, the chair of the New Towns Task Force, which is charged with overseeing plans to create dozens of new towns over the coming decades, each with 10,000 homes or more. We are unlikely to see church buildings appear in new town designs, but they will certainly include a mixed-use community centre, a school, and some social housing. The Church could offer to provide all of these: social housing through the Church Housing Association, Church of England schools through the Diocesan Boards of Education, and support with overseeing the physical community centre. If we're able to do this in a joined-up way, these services could fund one or more neighbourhood chaplains who would welcome and support new residents and help build the relational infrastructure needed for new towns to have a soul, becoming places where people delight to call home. Of course, parish and minster churches like this one have fulfilled this placemaking role down the centuries. But we have a wonderful opportunity to reimagine how the Church can serve new towns and communities and develop innovative ways of funding that work without drawing on existing parish or diocesan budgets. The government is setting a target to build 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. More houses are necessary, but not sufficient to solve the housing crisis. As Basil Jellicoe insisted, housing is not sufficient. And the Church should respond to this through leading by example. We should be a prophetic voice that says, let's create relational communities not just build houses. Let's make inclusive neighbourhoods where there's a home for everyone that reflects their innate dignity. Let's design beautiful houses that are adaptable for different generations. Let's keep making the sacrifices necessary for everyone to live in a decent, affordable home so that dignity and justice prevail. Let's be architects of place where our children and grandchildren can put down roots, experience belonging, and create streets, neighbourhoods, and towns where individuals, families, and communities can enjoy the abundant life that God intends for everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for such a rich lecture. You have toured us through some inspiring Christian examples. You have provided us with Christian resources, but also, I think, charted a really imaginative Christian response for the future. And dare I say, I think in there, a theology of housing that is both practical but rooted. So thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. We've now got some time for questions. So I will run around with this microphone, and I open the floor now for those who would like. Mr. Matthews.
Yes, thank you very much. Last week we learned about the environment. I'm wondering to what extent the church bodies that you've described would model new building where, for example, there is grey water harvesting, where there is communal energy supplies, where the sewage goes into a reed bed rather than and so forth. I see these as communal spaces because everyone is linked together in the way that they live and the way that their lifestyle is managed. But I don't get the impression, possibly because of the planning permissions and might be relaxed, I don't get the impression that we're necessarily going to be really innovative for 21st century housing as things are relaxed, understandably, to get more houses built.
Yeah, I think there is a danger in that. I agree with you. I visited a housing association in Chelmsford not long ago who are struggling to afford more houses, and they admitted that the first thing to go is their attention to the ecological and the environmental issues in an effort to create more houses. So I agree with you, that's a danger. If the 5 S's, the 5 core values, properly get established, and certainly in the vision of the Church Housing Association and the Church Development Agency, who are wanting to build more houses, and I think with the Church Commission as well, there is a commitment, and it's the sustainability S that speaks to it. But I suspect, and I'm absolutely no expert when it comes to the building and the development and the planning and all of that, I suspect there may be different levels, and we will aspire to the highest, but as you say, it'll depend on other factors. And there'll have to be real determination to this, but it's kind of competing priorities, isn't it? If you're in dreadful temporary accommodation that's got mould going up the walls, you're not going to be so worried about that. So we have to kind of be realistic, but it's absolutely there as part of the 5 S's. Thank you.
See you. As you were talking about the new communities where there is no church presence, and I was just remembering when I was in Oxford Diocese, I went to a church, they called it the Cathedral in a Field, and it was a Victorian church, and it could seat 450 people in a parish which had less than 200 people in it. And I wondered whether part of our problem is that we've got churches where there aren't people, and we've got no churches where there are people. And so is part of the housing solution actually a radical look at where our churches are and how we use them, and being a bit brave and bold in that? Is that part of the answer to the housing issues that we've got?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. It's good to see you. Yes, our buildings are a double-edged sword, aren't they? They're a great gift, and in the right place, they become a resource for the community, as I know this Minster is, and many of our churches are. But you're right, many of them are not in the right place, particularly those in the rural areas. And of course, they're often the very ones that are Grade 1 listed or Grade 2. So we are restricted in what we can do. I think we also lack a joined up approach to what we're going to do about our buildings, because I think 10, 15 years down the line, we are going to have a massive crisis with our buildings, because many of them, particularly the small rural ones, are being kind of held together by a handful, literally a handful of people who are in their 70s and 80s. And when the last of them closes the door and doesn't come back the following Sunday, we're going to have suddenly a lot of completely empty buildings. I think one of the challenges at the minute is that churches that are small, particularly in rural areas, feel very vulnerable, and they have a worry that the big bad diocese or somebody is going to come and close them down. So they're defensive, they're anxious, they're worried, and they don't want to have the conversation. And actually, the truth is, we have no powers to do that. We have no power. I don't particularly want to do it, but even if I did, we would have no powers. But the challenge is actually to get the local community to even have the conversation, because it's like they put their fingers in their ears and go la 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 la, and hope that the problem's going to go away. And the truth is that for some of them, the feeling is, as long as it sees me out, I don't really mind what happens next. So I think we do have a big challenge with our buildings. Where we can, where the buildings are not Grade 1 and 2 listed, and I referred to this in this talk, and there are patches of land around, or old buildings that can be regenerated, then I think there are some examples of some good projects. You knock down the old, and then you build a new, more appropriate building with some community facilities around, or a few flats or houses. So there are some examples, but I think we need to be a lot more courageous and brave. And I don't know how we solve the problem of the Grade 1 listeds. That's way above my pay grade. But we've got to face it. I'm sorry, that's not a particularly helpful answer, but I think you raise an important point.
Can I just ask a question? Do you think housing policy is really reflecting the changes that are actually happening in society? And I've just got a couple of things. I heard them on the radio a little while ago, and I was quite shocked. It said in the 2021 census, they found that 30% of households in England and Wales were comprised of just one person living alone. And that was 8.4 million people living alone. Yeah. Also, half of all people living alone in the UK in 2023 were aged 65 plus. And I was just wondering, do you think we can really expect to house everybody, given those changes that more and more people are now living alone?
I agree with you. I've heard similar statistics to that. And one of the problems, of course, is if you have an elderly person, for example, living in a 4-bedroom house that they no longer need, when they come to sell it, if they want to get the full value on it, the likelihood of a young family with 3 children being able to buy it is very small. So it's partly to do with costings and prices. And of course, it's always everything is much more exaggerated in London and the southeast in particular. And there is talk of encouraging people to live in the size of the house that they need. But, the market drives these things. We do need more new builds. There's no doubt about that. A large percentage of this country is undeveloped rural land, and we need to keep a lot of that. Much of the land is undevelopable, but there is developable land that could provide good decent homes for many, many more people. And we do need that, but you encounter a lot of people who will agree with that until the development is in their neighbourhoods, and then they don't want it. And one of the things I've discovered in my 4 years of involvement in this is how immensely complex the whole system is, because there are so many bit players, so many, landowners and developers and planners, and it's just projects take a huge amount of time to get across lines. But I think the potential is there for many more houses, and the repurposing of existing properties that are, environmentally very poor or just haven't had any work done on them. The carbon footprint, in a sense, is already there. It doesn't need building, but we have many properties that are vacant, unused, and have the potential to provide flats and houses and so on. So, I mean, I can't give you the maths. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but I'm pretty confident that we have the capacity to do it. But the question is whether we have the will and the ability to join up all the dots.
Living alone,
Yeah.
it's going to, the number of houses that are going to be required, the number
Yes.
of living accommodation to actually
Yeah.
deal with that is.
And there are efforts to build houses. So when there's going to be a new development in a new neighbourhood, good developers will consult the neighbourhood to see what is needed in this place. If there's a high percentage of key workers, for example, then housing that is suitable for key workers. If there's a high percentage of elderly people, then suitable houses for elderly people that might encourage some people to move, that then releases their property. So good developers won't just arrive somewhere and build what they fancy. They'll consult with the community and look to see what the needs are in that particular area. And there are people involved in, housing for older people is a significant need and might go some way towards helping what you're saying.
Thank you for the talk, Bishop. I know with some of the new developments where they have had community chaplains, there have sometimes been issues where the community space has been the last thing to be built. And so the community chaplains come in and had no people, and it's caused problems, and it's been very difficult to then bring a community together when people have already moved in and sided off and got their routines. Is that caught people's attention, and have kind of strategies been amended to try and address that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm sure you're right in some places. I mean, that's why we would quite like to get involved with, if we can, this meeting that I mentioned with Sir Michael Lyons next week, the new Towns Task Group. If we can get a foot in to be part of the conversations, those are exactly the kind of things we might be able to address. I mean, I recognise the challenge for our parishes, because we've got many parishes all around the country where already the clergy and the leadership team and the lay people in that place are pressed trying to provide ministry and so on, and suddenly they're going to have 2,000 new homes, and they just haven't got the capacity to reach out to them. So the more we can do things in the right order, obviously the better. And I think that the new towns that will be starting to mushroom over the coming years, the more as churches we can be involved early, the better. Yeah, thank you.
Bishop, thank you for the excellent presentation. Now, I have an idea where you mentioned the 5 S's, the environmental concern, I thought. How is that sustainable, building all these new towns, and managing a sustainable environment? Those new towns will be built on possibly green and brown belt sites, and surely we need to look after those. And my other feeling towards this was the housing crisis itself. Is that not being made about from all this influx of high immigration, And so those are my, and the gentleman on the right, he mentioned about the individuals living alone. I mean, that's a cultural problem. Surely that needs to be looked at. I mean, why is there a system where all these people are living alone? Yeah. That was my concern, though, the environment.
Yeah.
Why are the new towns being built? Surely look after the old buildings, develop and repair and make them sound, and that way you don't get an environment problem. With building all these new towns will cause an environment problem. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a balance to be had. I'm certainly with you that we need to see more of the old unused buildings redeveloped where possible. Sorry, what is? Okay, yeah. I don't know the area. I'm sorry, I don't know the area. But there are certainly lots of examples of places where old, unused buildings could be developed and used for housing. Yeah, absolutely. But I think, I have had, as you can imagine, I get all kinds of emails, and I do get people writing and saying this whole house building thing's a nonsense because it's bad for the environment. But it is a balance, because to the person who doesn't have an adequate home to live in, it's very easy for me to say, don't build any more houses, but we've got 8 million people in this country living in unsuitable or temporary accommodation. So we have to... Okay, so I'll address the immigrant question that you've... Okay. Well, if you maybe give me a chance to try and answer, I can't promise that it'll satisfy you. Okay, I think it's very easy to look to blame. We often look to blame other people for problems that might be quite separate. I think the numbers of asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants, actually, when we think about what they have contributed to society, I'm not quite sure what we'd do in our hospitals and care homes, for example, if we said let's have no immigrants. I think that issues are separate. I think it's very easy, and I understand this, that local communities will say, we don't have enough houses, and all these immigrants are coming and taking our houses. I think they're separate issues. I think we need to address the housing crisis, and we need an efficient, robust, fair asylum system that treats people with dignity, sees their claims through quickly, returns those who don't have permission to stay, but works towards integrating those who are given permission to stay, because they then become our neighbours. So I think they're both important issues, but I don't think it's as straightforward as saying if we didn't allow in any refugees or immigrants, we wouldn't have a housing problem. I think we still would.
Thank you. I'm the father of sons who are competing for housing in London,
Okay,
and I'm interested in the rent situation, because I wonder whether the church could push a model which exists in some areas, I think with housing associations, where new builds are for rent, and new builds, people can buy a new build, but they can never sell it for more than the average price, affordable price for the average wage. Sorry,
I know what you mean.
Capped.
I think, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And it helps to cut through this issue. And I suppose to some extent I've benefited from it, in that we inherit homes, we buy homes which then inflate extraordinarily, and those who have houses do very, very well. Those who have never been on the ladder never get on that ladder. So I think, I wonder what could be done about rent and mortgage and resale and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got 3 young adult children who are facing exactly the same situation, and that's the generational difference, isn't it? And the right to buy that came in the 1980s was enormously helpful to that generation. My own in-laws were amongst them. But of course, the problem was that the government didn't continue to build council houses at a pace that people were buying them. So I think in terms of the church's involvement, our primary purpose is to provide social housing, really, and that's usually rental. So the Church Housing Association, for example, would be renting. Or the other model that's being looked at in some places are the almshouses, which provide for particular categories of people. I don't know the ins and outs of what restrictions you can put on house sales and precisely how that works. But absolutely, if there is land being sold, for example, if the church is selling land, I think it can put certain restrictions on, for example, how many affordable houses does the developer need to put on it, or indeed how many social houses. But I don't know whether they can then put restrictions on sale as well. But really what we're interested in is staying involved in the lives of the people, hence renting, because you then have a stake in people's lives and you help look after the buildings and so on. It's also much more risk, it involves greater risk, and which is why people are nervous of it. So I think those things are possible to certain degrees, but I don't know, I'm afraid, enough detail.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for coming out here on what happens to be your birthday.
Ah, yes. My goodness, yes.
That's all you have.
Yeah. Thank you.
You've shown me up in my research here.
You don't read The Guardian.
Oh, gosh, okay.
Hello, Bishop. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
I was sort of thinking, all of what you have said is so valuable, but it all takes money. And what has happened in lots of cases is lots of different local authorities have found money really hard to come by, and some of them are almost, well, where I used to come from, Croydon is suffering sort of bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So that's my question about, and I'm not expecting you to know those answers, but it's a very real problem because all of this is great, but it takes money to be able to do it.
It does, you're absolutely right. Where we are quite an attractive partner, as the church broadly, is that we have the land. So we are, there are conversations going on all over the place with local authorities who, you're absolutely right, many don't have much money, but many don't have any land either. So in some places they're quite keen to partner. And we're reliant also on the goodwill of good developers, builders, architects and so on, who are willing to not gain the highest possible degree of profit that they can, which is partly why I said how complicated I find the operation of these things, because there's all these different partners. And as the church, although we have the land and we have buildings and assets, we're poor in terms, or at least parishes and dioceses are poor in terms of liquid assets to put the money in, which is exactly why we struggle, I think, to use our land as well as we might. But you're absolutely right. So the other thing to mention perhaps is a company called Knight Frank have developed a mapping tool, and they have mapped all Church of England land and properties for us to enable dioceses particular, but arguably parishes as well, to be able to look and see how individual bits of land might fit alongside other bits of land. So where there's adjacent land, for example, with another property owner or a local authority or something like that, and you've got a bigger area to work on. So the mapping tool is beginning to be quite useful in allowing people or the church to think strategically about where it has land and how best to use it, because it's quite a complicated picture, as you probably know. The church commissioners own by far the most amount of land, but nobody can tell them what to do with it, and their primary purpose is to increase their assets to keep the church going in perpetuity, I think it says, or something like that. 42 dioceses, nobody can tell any of them what to do, and then 16,000 parishes. So it's very, very complicated. And all of these things make it slow, make it expensive, and make it challenging.
Bishop Guli, thank you very much for everything you've offered us this evening. This is an extremely complex area,
Yeah,
but your place at the heart of it for the church, helping build relationships with others across the country, certainly gives me a great hope. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Thank you much for your considered answers, and particularly your rootedness here in the gospel principles, not least to the dignity of the human person at the heart of it all. Please can we give Bishop Guli another big round of applause.
Thank you very much.
There are some drinks at the back for those who would like to stay. Please do get to know Network and enjoy the evening.